Thank you, Rosemary. And I have a couple of words of thanks. First to Belinda for organizing this critical conversation here at Rutgers. And second to the other panelists. We're just two left and before long it'll just be one, but nonetheless, I wanted to say this, that, I think that the Black protest movements in Europe last spring have really inspired an outpouring of webinars just like this one. And it tends to be the same folks who keep getting tapped to share their insights and expertise. And I just wanted to recognize their time and energy and commitment to keep participating in these exchanges. I think that unequal burden sharing is increasingly recognized, to some extent at least, when it comes to academic service, but I think it's much less so with regards to the division of intellectual labor in the academy. So I hope the explosion of interest in Black Europe outlasts our current moment, and that sooner rather than later, many more Europeanists could be called upon to say something meaningful about Black Lives Matter in Europe. So some of the webinars that I've seen on BLM in Europe this fall have taken the form of a question: do Black Lives Matter in Europe? And in a riff on that formulation, as my point of departure today, I would like to ask, does Europe matter to Black lives in France? I think it does, in important ways that often get overlooked in both historical research and public debates about identity, inequality, and belonging in France today. The national narrative about France's distinctive political culture of Republican universalism and color evasiveness, to use Amelia's term from the morning, is still so robust that transnational perspectives on the African diaspora and those racialized as Black in France that point beyond the bounds of France's former empire or the Francophone Afro-Atlantic world have really made little headway in and out of the academy. So in the first part of my remarks today, I'll consider how the transnational and interdisciplinary field of Black European studies challenges both that French national narrative and French academic norms about what constitutes legitimate forms of knowledge. I'll also point to some of the limits of that challenge and suggest a few ways we might push the needle even further. And I'll conclude with a few very preliminary sketches about the resonance of transnational modes of identification in France and Europe more broadly today. So, maybe at this point in the program today, an overview of Black European studies will seem redundant, but nonetheless, I'll take a minute to just highlight some of the signal contributions of this exciting emergent field. For more than 2 decades now, a growing body of work on Black Europe has been challenging traditional ways of thinking about European history, the boundaries of Europe, and what it means to be European. This rich literature also unsettles conventional frameworks for studying the global African diaspora and notions of Blackness that have long privileged the historical trajectory of Afro descendants in the Americas and in the US especially. So put simply, as Kira and Kaneda, who was also supposed to be here, have argued in Black Perspectives in 2016, Black Europe is a useful category of historical analysis. It's also a provocation that demolishes the racist equation of European and white. It makes invisible histories visible, and it opens up new perspectives on Black globality. So Black Europe brings Europe more fully into the Black Atlantic, where of course it has always been envisioned, but somehow as soon as you say Black Atlantic, it sort of cleaves wherever you're talking about out of Europe and pulls it into this Black space, preserving, the whiteness of Europe. So Black Europe brings Europe more fully into the Black Atlantic, but it also really pushes beyond it, inviting other ways of thinking comparatively and transnationally about Black histories and processes of racial formation. So the rise of Black European studies, I would suggest, is an especially welcome and potentially transformative development for French scholars working on the African diaspora, those racialized as Black, and anti-Black racism in France. The intellectual legitimacy of that kind of research is still frequently called into question in French academia, especially when put forth by junior scholars who themselves come from racialized and minoritized groups. A 2019 special issue of the journal Mouvement, titled Intersectionality, offered a grim look at the way such scholars and their work are not only devalued by many of their white colleagues, but also are blamed for everything from the supposed plague of identity politics in French society at large, to everything from the collapse of the workers' movement and the uptick in Islamist terrorism in recent years. So against that inhospitable national backdrop, the increasing salience of Black Europe as a transnational research agenda in Europe, not just or even primarily among American academics, which is really key, so it's not seen as a foreign import by, American scholars who white French academics think are obsessed with race and either misguidingly or maliciously are importing these irrelevant and inappropriate racial paradigms into French studies. This sense that Black European studies, study of Black Europe, is an indigenous European development is really key and potentially a game changer. As Black European studies has come together as a field, it's created new sites of transnational intellectual exchange and sociability, like the biennial Afro-Europeans Conference, which if anybody ever has an opportunity to go to, I strongly suggest you do. It's unlike any other European conference space that you see, where marginalized scholars can find professional recognition, intellectual stimulation, and camaraderie, and where delegitimized and undervalued knowledge about Black France can flourish. So institutionally, professionally, and thematically, Black European studies poses a transnational challenge to a good deal of business as usual in the French academe. But the transnational interpretive possibilities of Black Europe as an analytical framework and its ramifications for how we think about Black histories and racial formation in France, or in any other national context in Europe for that matter, I think have yet to be fully fleshed out. Kira won't be here for the Q&A, but I would have posed this as a question to all of the other panelists working in different national contexts, but maybe the rest of the audience can take this up in discussion. The very corpus that historicizes Black Europe, studies of Afro-Germans, Black British, Black France, Black Italy, and so on, certainly encourages comparison, but it's not always clear if Black European history amounts to something more than the sum of its parts. Transnational Black politics, intellectual exchange, activism, and sociability are perhaps easiest to see in the Europe of the present, but this too, of course, has a history. Though Europe has often been the level at which racial formation and racist exclusion takes place, and indeed, as Amelia reminded us earlier, where white supremacy was born, a countervailing tradition of Francophone thought has imagined transnational Europe rather differently as a space of potentially greater inclusion, empowerment, and belonging than the nation state could ever offer. For some African politicians and activists in France after World War II, the incorporation of French Africa in the transnational Europe that was then only just starting to take shape presented an attractive alternative to either remaining under the exclusive orbit of the French Republic or acceding to national independence. The most prominent champion of this view, as many people might know, was famed Negritude poet and first president of independent Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Senghor served as a deputy in the French National Assembly for some 15 years, and perhaps less well known, also served as one of the French delegates to the European Parliamentary Assembly in Strasbourg. He was an ardent European federalist, but of a particular kind. Senghor believed that by bringing the rest of Europe into the France-Africa relationship, by creating Eurafrica, Africans would be more free in their home countries, in France, and elsewhere in Europe. He also believed that a Eurafrican federation would provide a viable framework for greater African unity on the continent, solidarity with the diaspora, and more symmetrical relations between Europe and Africa overall. Senghor's vision of Eurafrica was definitely idiosyncratic. For most of his contemporaries, Eurafrica was motivated by a colonialist ethos of exploiting Africa's immense natural wealth and human resources for European gain. As a result, the term itself is super toxic in contemporary French discourse, as former French President Nicolas Sarkozy belatedly learned after invoking it in a spectacularly out of touch and much maligned speech at the University of Dakar in 2007 while he was president. It's important to know. But nevertheless, the core of Senghor's Euro-African vision has retained a hold on the Francophone imagination. In her latest book, Cameroon-born writer Leonora Miano conjures up Afropean, which she calls a, quote, post-Western and post-racist utopia. So not a post-racial, but a post-racist utopia. Miano has been a key popularizer of the term Afropean in French literature for the past decade. And in a recent interview, she characterized Afropeans as a potentially transformative, regenerative force for European societies that could help Europeans finally overcome their colonial impulses, much as Senghor had figured an egalitarian Euro-Africa as a form of decolonization for both Europe and Africa some 70 years earlier. Miano likewise suggests that Afropeans' attachment to Africa could neutralize Europe's rapacious and extractive designs on the continent and recalibrate Europe-Africa relations in the interest of both parties. And yet, in another echo of Senghor, she calls on Afropeans to organize themselves in a Europe-wide federation to create identifiable Afropean institutions and establish permanent liaisons and contacts with Euro deputies. She forcefully extols what she calls Afropean lobbying at the European level to advance Afropean claims in different European national contexts. So Miano's Afropean conceptual repertoire seems to resonate with young people in France. Just how much is at this point hard to say, but to take a very small and super unscientific sample, we can look to Amandine Gay's very powerful 2017 documentary, Ouvrir la Voix, or Speak Up, which is constructive out of extensive on-camera interviews with dozens of Black women in continental France. And just for those who teach Black Europe or about Black Germany, you know, the film would pair extremely well with the Showing Our Colors anthology, amplifying the voices of, you know, Afropean women across the continent, or at least in a comparative transnational perspective. So in a segment in Amandine Gay's film, in which the women are asked how they self-identify, 2 of the 7 who respond on screen say they prefer Afropean. The first says that she first encountered the term in Miano's work and that it spoke to her instantly. And you can really see this intense emotion, like she is so moved by the term and, you know, how deeply and profoundly it resonated and provided, you know, sort of this very unexpected alternative that she had never thought of, and, you know, is herself sort of surprised by its resonance. And the second woman who identifies with this term says that Afropean, likewise, incredibly in this moving register, is the only term that she feels allows her to express what she says is that she is France-born, Afro-descendant, and noir in a way that she says isn't torn, but rather peaceful and healthy. She adds, and I quote, "The word Afropean allows me to reconcile all that in a way that's more calm. Finally, there is a word that links my French culture with my Afro-Caribbean culture." So the appeal of Afropean as an identity for this woman is clearly deeply imprinted with her place, her location in France, and her connection to French and Afro-French culture. But when we look at formulations of Afropean in other national contexts, we encounter some very similar logics and rationales. Sheffield-born Johnny Pitts, in his 2019 travelogue Afropean, Tales from Black Europe, says the term Afropean, and I quote, "encouraged me to think of myself as whole and unhyphenated. Here was a space where Blackness was taking part in shaping European identity at large. It suggested the possibility of living in and with more than one idea, Africa and Europe, without being mixed this, half that, or Black other." So to be sure, as even the super small sampling in Gay's film makes clear, there's no one monolithic way that Black women in France today see themselves. Two of Gay's interlocutors actually unreservedly self-identify as French. A third identifies as Afro-descendant, and another simply as une Afro, an Afro. And incidentally, Gay herself has said in public appearances elsewhere that she also prefers that term Afro, precisely because it links her to, you know, particular histories and cultures in Africa and the Antilles, which of course we've seen was also the logic for Afropean, and which probably is also the logic for Afro-descendants. So, you know, it's a real effective register and question that we're dealing with here. But regardless of whether they identify with terms, you know, with any of these women identify with terms like Afropean that have explicitly European overtones, it is super clear that the women in Gay's film are wrestling with questions of identity, belonging, and racialization that are widely shared across the African diaspora in contemporary Europe. So, you know, and this is my concluding thought, I've been very quick, a nation-based approach that rehearses the ritualistic return to French universalism and colorblindness endowed with seemingly endless explanatory power, clearly won't do full justice to their histories, lived experience, or diasporic horizons. The transnational potential of a Black European framework may fare much better. And that's it.